Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's lesson in Advanced Substance Painter Techniques. These techniques are designed to help you get the most out of Substance Painter. There's a lot of really cool things you can do in Substance Painter, but unfortunately, it's also a very complex process. So, what I've decided to do for this week is to break down our different uh, sections and different techniques that I'm going to show you into different videos. So you can easily refer back to a specific technique if you need help with that one. So the first thing that we're going to do in this video is we're going to bake our model. What do I mean by baking? In 3D rendering, I will make this a little bit easier to, yeah, there we go. Okay, so in 3D rendering, we have a lot of very fine detail that can take up a lot of polygons can be represented in the material using things like height maps and metallic and roughness and different channels within the material to kind of fake the actual detail. And that's good because that'll save us on a lot of polygons. And as I've mentioned several times before, low polygon models are much better for video games. They're a lot easier to render on screen at any one time, especially when there's a lot of things happening like animations and lighting effects and things. So we want to make this high poly version of this model as low poly as possible without losing any of the detail. So how do we do that? Well, we'll start by if you have your high poly version of your model before you've done any compression on any removing any vertices or faces, lowering the poly count, and then you also want to have your low poly. As you can see, I have two versions of this scooter here. I have a high and a low poly version, and what I'm going to do now is prepare it to be sent to Substance Painter. So what happens when we bake? So baking puts information from a high poly, high detail version of a mesh into the material information for the low poly version. So if I were to have, say, this is a surface that I have, it's got a lot of crevices and a lot of different details in it. This is my high poly mesh. And then I have a low poly mesh that took that and just kind of smoothed it out and said, we're going to lose some of that detail in order to save on poly count. What baking does is it will take the, the distance between the surface of the low poly mesh and the surface of the high poly mesh and create a map by reflecting, for lack of a better term, rays above and below the low poly mesh and calculating the distance between that and the high poly mesh and creating a height map. I guess more correctly, it's a normal map, but what it does is it creates that detail and puts it into a flat image, which is then used as one of the channels in our materials. So what we get to do is, in order to set up this object for export, we need to do a couple of different things. The first one is we need to create a high and a low poly version of our model. So I did minimal reduction on this one just for this example. But if I had my high poly version of this scooter, which has 382,000 tries, that's a lot, even for a high poly model for a vehicle like this. We don't really want to be using that in a game. And I reduced it to 257,000 tries. Now, again, still a lot, but for this example, this is what I was able to get it to quickly. The next thing, once we have our two models, is we want to make sure that they're in the same location in our scene. Our translation, rotation, scale are all the same. And the reason that that's important is if we go back to this little diagram I showed, is it's going to cast the rays point to point from the low poly model to the high poly model. So if our models are in the exact same location, what point casts a ray to another point will be 1-to-1 the same on both high and low poly models. Now, if we were to say have our high poly model over here and our low poly model over here, it would try to shoot that ray and not hit anything or hit the wrong thing. So if we go back over to Maya and say I had my high poly model over here, and then we tried to do a map, or we tried to do a bake, the low poly model wouldn't have anything to associate it with. So we want to make sure that our models are exactly on top of each other. The next thing we want to do is naming conventions. This is important for Substance Painter. What this is going to do is make the actual baking process a lot easier for us and a lot more automated. So what I've done is, you can see that there I have a scooter underscore high and a scooter underscore low. Anything in the groups, anything in the layers inside of each of these has that suffix, that underscore high for the high poly one, and underscore low for the low poly one. I'll get into why this is important when we go into Substance Painter, but you want to make sure that all of your groups and all of your different meshes and everything inside of each of your objects has that in its name in the outliner. The last thing that we want to do is something that I've already showed you for Substance Painter, and you could probably see if I hide my low poly scooter, is assign different material slots for our texture map inside of Maya. So we want to do this on our high poly model only. We don't want to do it on our low poly model. In fact, if you look at my low poly model, it just has a single material, a single Lambert material. And our high poly one has basically what I've done is I've taken the different components of the scooter that I would expect to have similar materials and group them with the same base Lambert materials in Maya. I still have a couple of spots here that I'm going to show you just to make sure that everyone's aware of how this works. But in the high poly model version of our scooter, I will go into our is this the handles? Okay, I want these. These guys will give a different material, so we'll assign a new material. We'll choose a Maya Lambert, and we're going to give this one. And all we really want to do is make sure that we use different colors for these groupings, so that we can tell what they are, and also so that Substance can tell what they are when we're attempting to match these groupings for masking reasons, which I will talk about when we get to the masking part of this week. So I've used a lot of colors already, so I don't really want to duplicate too many colors, but let's go with that. The mirrors can actually have the same as that. That's totally fine. The side mirrors, that's that one. The control panel, I actually, for the sake of this, I'm actually going to make these the same color as the trim. So we'll right click, go down to assign existing material, and I think the trim was Lambert 3. Am I right? Yeah, that's that yellow. And then the speedometer, same deal. I'll give that the same Lambert 3. And I know that this headlight, okay, cool. So the headlight's going to have that same, well, if that's the case, then actually, so those two have the same material, or those two are part of the same mesh. So let's give this a new material. And the reason why is I don't want that light bulb to have the same color as the trim. So we're going to give this let's give it a dark gray. That should be fine. All right, so now that we have done that, and we have our high and our low poly versions of our models ready to go, we will take the high poly version, shift click, so you're highlighting everything for the high poly version, in your outliner, and then we're going to go to export selection, and we're going to export it. I've already exported this, but you're going to export this as, so for this one, it's scooter underscore high, and we want to export it as an FBX. FBX, and export that there. And then we want to do the same thing for the low. Export that. Make sure it's an FBX. Can't spell. Scooter underscore low. All right. So now that we have our two meshes, we're going to go into our Substance Painter. Inside of Substance Painter, we'll start by opening a new file. Whatever your document resolution is, you can set it to 1K, 2K, 4K. Not that it matters, but that will affect the resolution of your material. So if I go into 4K and then select a file, we are going to pull in our low poly version of our scooter. All right, and then we'll click OK. And I should have mentioned this, but make sure that your UVs are set correctly, as I explained in the previous lesson, to before you export everything for your high and low poly models. They should have the same UV map, and you just want to make sure that those are set up before you export. So now that we have our model, our low poly model set up in our in Substance, what we're going to do is we're going to bake it, and you can do that by either going to Mode, Bake Mesh Maps, or you can click on this little croissant on the right side right here, and that'll open up your baker. And what we're going to do is go through these different settings. So the first one is output size. You want your output size to match your document size. So I did 4K, so I'm going to set this to 4K. And then you want to go down to your high poly parameters. And this is why we set up two different meshes, a high poly mesh and a low poly mesh. If I click on this little paper here to open up our options for high definition meshes, we grab our high poly one and we open it up. And now we get this bubble outline around our mesh. This is called a cage, and this is going to give us the height and depth at which the those rays get projected off of our low poly mesh. So we can affect that with our max frontal distance and max rear distance. So if I increase this, it will increase the distance at which the frontal or the front and rear rays are projected from the low poly mesh. You won't really see much for the rear distance with this model because there's nothing really interior to it, but let's just go ahead and increase both a good amount, because we want to make sure that everything that this cage is projecting around, it actually will reflect into the normal maps. So we want to make sure that we grabbed everything. Next thing we want to do is let's look at our suffix options here, low poly and high poly mesh suffixes. This is why we named in Maya. This is why we named all of our different layers in our outliner high or low. And what it's going to do is it's going to automatically map the different meshes with the low suffix with different meshes with the high suffix with the same mesh name. And what that will let us do is if we go to match and we choose by mesh name, we can see that it takes our body mesh low and maps it to our body mesh high. So it's another way to make sure that the only points that are affecting each other in your bake are points in the matching meshes. I know we can do that. We can do that in our common settings. We also want to do that in our ambient occlusion under self occlusion, and in our thickness under self occlusion, only same mesh name. And this is to make sure that these two different channels don't actually affect other meshes that are next to the meshes that we're trying to match, just to give us a cleaner bake. Once that's done, let's go back to common settings, and we also want to look at anti-aliasing. You could add super sampling. 4x is a fine anti-aliasing option. Just gives us a little bit more detail. And then all we have to do is hit bake selected textures, and you'll watch the magic happen. This is going to take a little while, but what it's going to do is it's going to, as you can see over here, bake these different textures into our normal and other file types. And once that's ready to go, we can go return to painting mode. And here is our baked mesh. So I probably should have double checked to make sure that my my reduction was actually okay, because you can see this kind of issue here on the edges where the normal map didn't really collect the detail properly. If you get issues like this, you can go into your your baking again, and then adjust your frontal distance or your rear distance depending on what the issue is. And I think probably like there is probably okay. We can reduce this a little bit and then just rebake it. If there are details in the mesh that it's not baking at all, then you'll need to make sure that you have expanded that cage around those parts. And we'll probably still get issues. Yes, a little bit better, but not great. Fortunately, when we get into masking, I'll show you how to help hide that a little bit. But that is it for baking. Once your mesh is baked, it is ready to be painted on and masked, which I will get to in our next video. So see you guys then.